Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pincher Creek Library's annual Winter Speaker Series. This has been going on for quite a few years, and although it is quite different this year in terms of how we're attending it, it doesn't make it any less exciting. I'm very excited to hear all four of our speakers in this series this year. So I have the pleasure of introducing Kirby England to you tonight. Kirby England is a riparian and wetland ecologist with 20 plus years of experience on the interaction of plants, water, and wildlife. Following 5 years at Cows and Fish, alongside the completion of an MSc at the U of S, focused on urban beavers, he is now a faculty member in the School of Environmental Sciences at Lethbridge College. Kirby is also the owner and principal consultant at Ubetula Environmental Inc., a consulting firm specializing in riparian and waterland management with a focus on cost-effective coexisting with our original but still very active riparian managers, the North American beaver.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sam. Appreciate it. So our topic for the evening is, of course, beavers, which, as you'll hopefully learn if you didn't already know, are certainly the best dam riparian managers on our landscape. However, the beavers' management style doesn't always agree with our own. And so the subtitle of how we might better live alongside beavers will be covered tonight as well. With that, let's get started. They say that the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their proper name. So to begin our wisdom sharing tonight, you'll want to know that the North American beaver wears the scientific name Castor canadensis, which links it to the other living beaver species, Castor fiber, present more in Europe, and also, of course, to Canada. Although it may feel for some folks like there's already probably beavers everywhere, here we have an indication of the probable historic range of beavers on our continent. Castor canadensis was by no means restricted to the true north, strong and free. In fact, the only places they aren't, right, the very far north, very southern extent, and a few islands separated by salt water. Estimated with the distribution we just saw is that prior to European arrival, beaver numbers in North America were likely between 60 million and 400 million. With this, beavers built dams on all but the largest rivers, and those dams were estimated to be at a density of 7 to 74 dams per kilometer of stream length. Can you imagine what that would look like? In the first 2.5 centuries of the fur trade, the number of beavers trapped increased annually. Intense rivalry between the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Fur Company, Astor Furs, and others compounded the problem. Competition caused many areas to be trapped out completely, unfortunately, often more out of spite and a scorched earth tactic than economic need or market demand. At the close of the fur trade, North American beaver numbers had dropped to as few as 100,000, with beavers totally absent in many former trapping areas, especially in Canada. Further, beaver dams and woody debris obstructions in streams were removed to make way for watercraft, and with the absence of the animals and their telltale dams, the way our watersheds looked and functioned would change drastically in only a matter of decades. So now that we've heard a little about beaver history, it's a good time to talk more about the critters themselves. Beavers are, of course, semi-aquatic mammals with one foot in water and the other on land. They're well adapted to that dual existence. Thanks to specialized membranes and skin folds, water's sealed out of a beaver's nose, ears, and mouths while swimming underwater. Their fur is made water repellent with repeated applications of castor oil produced from glandular secretions. To be clear, this isn't the same castor oil that some of you may also put in your hair. Fortunately, that castor oil actually comes from a seed. Although there are lots of uses for castor oil produced via beaver that you didn't necessarily know of. Think vanilla flavoring in ice cream, among others. As we see here, the beaver uses a split toe on the rear foot to distribute those waterproofing oils through their coat. Beavers are experts at holding their breath, staying underwater for up to 15 minutes, and using far less oxygen to fuel their brain than other mammals of comparable size. The broad, flat tail of the beaver is both rudder and propeller. And finally, the webbed hind feet are specialized for swimming. On land and within submerged substrates, beavers use their front paws and powerful digging claws to easily move soil and sediment. Their prominent incisors, hence the handle buck-toothed, are used to cut down trees and peel bark for eating. As you'll notice, it's actually the bottom teeth that protrude in front of the lips rather than the top, as nearly every single cartoon of a beaver would probably have you believe. Once you've seen that, you can't unsee it now, okay? Your job to spread the good word on beaver dentition. These teeth are harder on the front surface than on the back, ensuring that wear creates a constant sharp edge to enable beavers to easily cut through wood. The teeth grow constantly throughout a beaver's life, and even when more easily gnawed offerings are made available to the beaver, the animals need to chew wood or some other bite-resistant materials to wear down these ever-increasing incisors. The consequence, of course, to not wearing down your teeth for a beaver is fatal. They just keep growing. Imagine where that point's headed next. Okay. A beaver colony is a family operation at its heart. The hub is the dominant adult female, leading efforts to maintain the lodge, cache winter food, and keep dams functional. The adults in the lodge form a monogamous relationship that generally persists until one of the pair dies. Beavers breed in midwinter, and an average litter of 4 kits are born each spring. That kit number is going to vary generally based on latitude, longitude, access to resource, other factors, okay? More beaver out east, they're better breeders. The number of young born is related to food availability and the age of the female as well. As I just said, older beaver mothers have less offspring. Bear that point in mind, it'll become useful later. A typical colony of beavers will contain an average of 5 to 6 individuals. The adult pair, that's 2, the kits of the year, and the kits of the previous year. 1 or 2 juveniles are teenage beavers who are yet to leave the nest. To prevent the colony from becoming too densely populated, the 2-year-old beavers typically disperse to form new colonies in the spring. It's coincident with periods of runoff and high water, easier to move when there's lots of water flowing on and over land. Beavers may move 8 to 16 kilometers to find suitable conditions upon which to reestablish, although they've been known to make an epic 236 kilometer move combining in-water and overland travel. Beaver mark their territory with scent derived from those same castor glands they use to waterproof their fur. Up to 100 scent markers on mounds warn foreign dispersing beavers that this site is taken. Every colony highly territorial, making colonies of beavers distinct and for the most part non-overlapping. The density of colonies is regulated by territories, and those territories are regulated and limited primarily by food. Beaver density in many jurisdictions averages 1 colony for every 2-ish kilometers of stream or river length within suitable habitat. However, as part of my graduate research, we compared beaver colony density in and around Saskatoon and found that urban beavers had on average about 1 colony per 2.5 kilometers of river. And their country cousins outside of our urban area had on average 1 colony for every distance half of that. Suffice to say, it's quite an anomaly that the rural resident beavers are more crowded than the city folk. Usually it's the other way around, of course. Now, It's also not the spacing of the beavers along the stream that's most remarkable, so much as it is what beavers do with that water. In streams, the motive for dam building is to impound water to create a safe depth for the lodge, food caches, and as an access to supplies of trees and shrubs. Water depths stored behind dams have to be sufficient to allow for beaver movement under the ice in areas that freeze, and so the beaver can get out from their lodge and move out to the food cache, which is submerged and stored underwater. Beavers create dams with whatever materials handy: tree branches, logs, grass, rocks, and mud. Even cattails will be used when nothing else is available. Anything that can be rolled, floated, or dragged is a beaver building material in a pinch. I've found rocks, I've found old tarps, just about everything that you can imagine wedged into a beaver dam to maybe trap sediment and hold back water I've seen in there. I shouldn't say everything you can imagine. I'm yet to find a car in one, but I look at lots of dams. I'm sure it's just a matter of time, okay? Beavers will let you do most of the work if they can. Tree branches and logs are going to anchor the structure, while sediment from the stream bottom upstream of the dam is used to glue the materials in the dam together. Excavating substrate materials adjacent to the pond also helps deepen the ponded area. And although the dams wouldn't win a beauty contest or ever meet standard engineering protocols, they effectively capture and store water, their main objective, while also allowing some leakage to maintain flows downstream. It's a bit of a misconception that beaver dams stop flows. Recent research by the Wheaton Group and others have shown that when we look at base flows upstream and downstream of beaver dams pre and post removal, they're fairly consistent. It's a delay in water making it downstream, but the total volume doesn't actually typically change. So something interesting to note. Now, it isn't easy to categorize the structures that beavers build, but they might be considered a wet dam. Sort of four broad categories of beaver dam. Wu and Waddington did this work based on whether or not water can spill over the top, leak through the main bulk of the dam, and or seep underneath the dam. There's an inescapable logic to how water moves through a beaver dam. A leaky dam doesn't have as much pressure built up against it, and so it doesn't suffer from the same weight and velocity of water trying to force it downstream. Beavers have these built-in safety valves with a leaky dam and that relieve and reduce hydraulic pressure. Further, the welter of sticks and logs on the downstream face is going to effectively dissipate a lot of that erosive energy that would otherwise be spilling over and through the dam. So the base of the structure doesn't become eroded and undercut, which would then render the dam leakier than the beaver intended and no longer serving its purpose. There's, in essence, a myriad of pathways for water to take. Rarely does it flow directly into the downstream channel, and so beaver dams do a really good job of dissipating erosive flows. We'll talk about that more later on as well. And when we spot dams in adjacent to beaver lodges and other things, there's often a succession of dams, what we call secondary dams or check dams, built beyond, upstream, and flanking the primary dam that will impound water around the lodge and provide beavers access to food caches and foraging opportunities. Secondary dams are going to improve the transport of woody materials, extend the safe swimming range of the beaver, and ensure better year-round water supply. Beyond the impounded water, beavers excavate canals to transport food and dam building materials with ease and relative safety. The entirety of adjacent beaver dams and lodges, all associated with one active beaver territory, is called a lodge complex or a beaver lodge complex. And within that, we categorize primary and secondary lodges and primary and secondary dams and those sorts of things. So with shelter explained, it's time to change course over to beaver food. Although most foraging is going to take place within 60 meters of water, beavers will forage up to 250 meters from water if they must. The risks of predation and energy expense through foraging eventually become greater than the net return of food energy at a certain point. And beavers engage in this practice called optimal foraging theory. And so they do well to find the right balance of distance to gain. Okay, those beavers that get it wrong simply get eaten or starve to death. No real consequence there, right? If that isn't survival of the fittest, I don't know what is. Beavers engage in optimal foraging theory. Also, many woody species that beavers do forage regenerate quite quickly after beaver cutting. Regenerated aspen shoots and poplars included in that as well, populus spa, if you will, especially will develop bitter compounds called glycosides, and beavers will shift their foraging to larger stem diameters of other uncut woody plants after the plants start producing these secondary metabolites. This trend towards avoidance of certain woody species has been well documented in natural systems for beavers. It remains a little unclear what the role of human influence, on the woody vegetation community through the planting of non-native trees and shrubs may be. That question was actually part of the topic of some of my graduate work, and in another presentation, I'd be happy to share those results with you as well. Just remember, when it comes to beavers and woody vegetation, beaver cutting stimulates vigorous sprouting of willing so readily and the production of woody biomass increase subsequently that beavers and willows are sometimes called mutualists because of the overlap between the two. They've co-evolved since time immemorial, and there's still a strong working partnership. So for that reason, we see beaver often readily feeding on those willows and some select members of the populus genus. Through their flooding and foraging behaviors, where the habitat is suitable, beavers will change the watershed. Where there's potential, beavers could also expand their range outwards in our watersheds. Although beavers are generally believed to go through boom and bust cycles, there is more stability in many watersheds where colonies have persisted in the same location for over 30 years. And sometimes in some watersheds, those in Central California and other places, there's actually evidence that beavers have been in certain locations for up to 500 years. The cyclic nature of beavers and their food was probably less pronounced before humans and cattle arrived on the scene. And so we're an added agent of change in the disturbance regime between beavers and vegetation. So now that you understand a little bit more about beavers and what they're doing with their lives, I'd like to get a little further into why they can be well classified as the best dam riparian managers out there. Okay, well, remember, the beaver isn't just an animal, it's an entire ecosystem. For starters, beavers have a long history in building riparian foundations. Traditional ecological knowledge from various First Nations groups will tell us that beavers might have even pulled up the first piece of earth from the depths of a prehistoric water world, and in doing so, given us the materials needed to start building up livable land from there. Thanks, beavers. Whether or not that's true, given the more recent and well-recorded 10,000 plus years of beavers damming successively upstream from the lower reaches, repeating that process as old ponds become filled with sediment, beavers have had and continue to have profound effects on changing stream gradients, elevating stream channels, changing cross-sectional valley profiles, and aiding riparian vegetation. It's a step, a succession from one stage to another, the march of time in a beaver-occupied stream valley. What we see is beavers start out in a relatively steep gradient system. They start building dams, right? These steep systems evolve from a flatter, stair-stepped one into a slightly wider valley. Deep, rich soils from centuries of sediment capture, sub-irrigated with high water tables, create these fertile valley bottoms that persist even with reduced beaver activity. So our steep stage in 1, we start get beaver damming, the widening of that valley in 2, the aggradation of sediment behind the dams in 3, the deepening of the ponds. Eventually, as I said, beavers will eat themselves out of food availability for that period. They'll leave that area, the dams will breach, right? The water will drain, and we're left behind with these rich, well-hydrated sediments, which then are able to be colonized by vegetation, become those broad, well-vegetated valleys we see. And certainly a drive down Highway 22, the Cowboy Trail, it's just a lookout one side or the other to see these big, broad valleys that are incredibly valuable forage resources for cattle. And that's the result of centuries of beaver activity, coupled with glacial history and others that support it. And we know that through research done by Kim Green and my former supervisor, Sherry Westbrook, losing beavers from a watershed and breaching dams may cause erosion to increase, streams to downcut, sediment to be lost, and effectively reduce the meadow formation process begun decades earlier. So there's value in leaving the beavers' dams on the landscape and beavers there. Beaver ponds are also Mother Nature's natural water filter. They don't have to pay for a Brita. Ponds trap and store tons of sediment, which will improve water quality downstream. We know that erosion is a natural phenomenon, but as our land use increases, the sediment load produced exceeds the range of natural variation by several orders of magnitude. We see the consequences of that sediment buildup here. The sources of sediment are numerous: roads, trails, cut blocks, cultivated fields, even unchecked livestock grazing along stream banks can contribute to excess sedimentation. And so what we need is, of course, a way to capture some of that sediment. Now, the good news here is beaver dams capture and store much of that sediment, ranging anywhere from 3,500 to 6,500 cubic meters of sediment stored per pond. At the upper end of 6,500 cubic meters, this represents 382 tandem dump truck loads of sediment stored behind each beaver dam. And these are obviously quite sizable dams, but a massive sediment storage potential there. Sediment you don't end up having to drink. Okay. A recent study from Devon in southwest England, where beavers have been recently reintroduced, monitored water quality upstream and downstream from a series of beaver dams. In the research, they found significant differences in the amounts of suspended sediment below the beaver dams, as well as reduced phosphorus and nitrogen loads below the dams following capture. That was Puttock 2017. Other studies have confirmed similar findings, including reduced fecal coliforms. So much so that downstream of beaver dams, there may be 50 to 75% less suspended solids, 20 to 60% less phosphorus, 20 to 25% less nitrogen, and up to 23% carbon sequestered and stored, as well as, and this one's important, reduced fecal coliforms. I don't particularly like drinking poo water. I don't imagine you do either. And so any beaver dam that's willing to take out some of those coliforms is a real beneficial addition in my books. Okay. Beavers also put water in the bank. They store water. That is certainly a truism. During wet and dry years, the presence of beaver associated with a 9-fold increase in open water area in this study by Hood and Bailey. Nowhere is it better established that beavers are storing water than it was in the mixed wood boreal region of east central Alberta in and around Elk Island National Park and the Blackfoot Cooking Grazing Reserve. Beavers were completely eliminated from this landscape during the early 1900s. For those of you that don't know, if I follow Highway 630 here past North Cooking Lake, I hit Sherwood Park, then I hit Edmonton. Edmonton, the site of Fort Edmonton. You can pretty much count on every beaver within a couple hundred kilometers of Fort Edmonton was probably gone by as early as maybe the 1860s. So we more or less cleared beavers out of this country. What Dr. Hood and Suzanne Bailey did for this research was to examine and compare aerial photography of the region through 2 severe drought periods, one in 1950 prior to beaver reintroduction, and another again in 2002 post-beaver reintroduction on this landscape. What the research found was quite dramatic. They noticed that in 2002, even though this was a far more severe drought year than in 1950, the renewed presence of beavers on the landscape was associated with that 9-fold increase in open water area. The conclusion to draw there is that beavers are going to have a dramatic influence on the amount of open water at a landscape level, even more so than temperature, precipitation, and weather patterns, and other variables analyzed in the research. So beavers retained water on the landscape. We'll talk about why that is in more detail. And what you see, of course, here's a map made of pond 26, the bathymetry of that pond You see, of course, the deepest water, 225 to 250 centimeters, a little over 2 meters, right? A bit over my head, was still present. But beavers on the land increased the surface area of that pond through all of these little channels off to the side. We'll explain how those are formed. They're beaver canals. So in addition to the main body of the pond, the canals that beavers will excavate are going to be up to hundreds of meters long, cumulative length, most about a half a meter wide, some although up to 3 meters wide. That's the very edge of, can I jump over that without falling in it, by the way. And most are 0.5 to 0.75 meters deep, although some, as this unfortunate bird had to find out, are up to 1.5 meters deep. And so all of these canals added on to the pond are going to substantially increase the water storage potential. It's just increased surface area that the beavers are creating. Okay, and that's only the water we can see we've talked about so far. Beneath the pond and in the adjacent area, the flows between groundwater and surface water, what we call the hyporheic zone, we can multiply the surface water stored by the pond by about 5 to 10%, pardon me, times, not percent. So 500%, right? To get a better picture of overall groundwater storage associated with intact beaver ponds. Groundwater storage is going to extend up to hundreds of meters laterally based on superficial geology and as many as 300 to 600 meters downstream of the dam. And there's more work by Sherry Westbrook and others showing the connection of beaver dams to downstream influences. So suggest you pursue that if you're interested. The potential influence of about 2,000 meters squared beaver pond could easily exceed a kilometer squared. In summary, beaver ponds and canals are going to impound water, raise the water table, increase the soil water interface, increase duration of water content with the land, increase overbank flooding, increase the time water spends in a floodplain. In essence, beaver ponds are responsible for retention, detention, storage, and the slow release of water back into a system. And we'll talk about the organisms that benefit from that slow release of water. Spoiler alert, we're one of them. I'm going to have a slow release of water here. The other thing that beaver dams do in a system is they act as speed bumps. They discourage a speedy stream from rushing downstream. We used to think that was a good thing, and we built channels that conducted water across the landscape as quick as it possibly could because that seemed to us be the peak of efficiency. Of course, we've since learned that channelization has some pretty serious riparian health consequences and water quality consequences. And so we now appreciate the work that beavers do to increase the size of the effective floodplain and slow down the speed at which water moves through it. So it gets quoted up to about 12 times the increase of water stored on an active beaver floodplain than one that's absent of beavers. It's going to make the floodplain wider. It's going to make the floodplain more able to detain, restrain, and slow down that water from speeding through. A single beaver dam can actually have the same effect on the floodplain width as the area of a 1 in 200 year flood event. So really a lot of water dissipated over the floodplain by active beaver dams. For some, that's an unfortunate consequences. We'll talk about that in a minute. For others, those interested in water quality and watershed health, beaver dams play a really important role. And so in that same Devon, England study that I mentioned earlier, I have no relation to Devon, England, by the way. That's a place name, not a person name. Okay. A complex of 13 beaver dams was shown to reduce peak discharges by about 19% and total discharges by about 9% during a storm event. So a sizable reduction. What about a really big flood? Can beaver dams help prevent flooding, right? What would beaver dams do in the presence of a really large flood? So again, by Westbrook et al. 2020, 74 beaver dams were assessed after the 2013 flood in K Country. You'll call that the 2013 Calgary flood, right? The major flood. These flood attenuation benefits were recently demonstrated. Sherry and her students studied those 74 dams immediately after the 2013 flood. The results were just recently published, contrary to what many thought would happen. Rather than this unprecedented flood simply blowing apart beaver dams as if they were nothing on their way downstream, Dr. Westbrook reported that 68 of the 74 beaver dam systems were intact or partially intact still after the 2013 flood. So given that each beaver pond stores on average over about 4,000 meters cubed of water, with 4 of the largest ponds holding back a combined volume of nearly 20,000 cubic meters of water, beaver ponds can in fact delay the downstream transmission of flood water. And so you don't get that massive storm surge all at once. And there's a map, and there's the joy of going in to assess these dams post-flood. That sediment we stored is great, not fun to wade through. We call that boot-sucking mud. And many a hip wader has been lost to these conditions. Okay. I think Sam's taking a picture of that. I'll share the whole presentation if you'd like. So beavers are also out there controlling this thermostat in and around our aquatic ecosystems. Much of that water stored in shallow underground aquifers, as we said, may re-enter the channel downstream 300 to 600 meters further. That's going to keep water temperatures cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, and that's going to be to the benefit of trout and salmon. Anyone who's hung out in a comfortable in-ground root cellar in the middle of summer knows how nice it is to be a little subterranean. I have maybe some distant relatives by the name of Barefoot McGregor who lived underground. Again, that's a story for another time. Okay, there's a lag between the time that water enters the pond, is absorbed as groundwater, and its eventual release. That lag can be even up to 3 months. So a spring freshet in April or May, that's the big flood in the spring, right? In a properly intact beaver system might actually only have a lot of that water re-entering the system months later in the peak of summer when it's the hottest. And so what we see there is that water tends to emerge from these groundwater sources cooler than when it went in, and that's going to benefit fish, especially trout. Seen here is a grateful West Slope cutthroat trout out there enjoying cold, clean water. And talk about turning up the thermostat even hotter. Beavers can also play a role in wildfire mitigation as well. Here I'm going to let Dr. Emily Fairfax, an ecohydrologist at California State University Channel Islands, demonstrate how beavers can help in the era of fires. And it's not just cute animations about what might happen. Emily and her colleagues recently compared the width of burned riparian corridors in beaver dammed and undammed reaches of various streams in the western US where wildfires have been recently burning. What she found is that there are beaver dams. Where there are beaver dams, there's a noticeably wider, unburned riparian corridor. In essence, Emily, Dr. Fairfax was able to tell us how beavers became North America's best firefighter, Smokey the beaver. Okay. And so this of course benefit associated with the water storage benefits I've already talked about. By increasing water storage, creating more saturated above and below ground conditions, beavers can create wider unburned riparian corridors, and in some cases even have their dam complexes act as a fire break and prevent massive wildfires, which are becoming more and more common, from spreading even more rapidly across the landscape. So the bear makes a cute public marketing campaign, but Smokey the beaver might be far more effective. The unburned ribbons of riparian habitat especially after a fire, become essential and critical refuge areas for wildlife. But even in the absence of fire in these systems, beaver wetland complexes are biodiversity hotspots. Beaver workings contribute substantially to the complexity, connectivity, and vegetation diversity of landscapes, which translates to many more opportunities for wildlife species on, near, and beneath the surface of beaver ponds. Beaver ponds are out there creating unique habitat for numerous species, everything from fish to frogs to a variety of birds. Even ungulates like the moose are going to benefit from beaver ponds present on the land. And a vintage slide here reminding us that riparian areas are a magnet for fish and wildlife. 80% of fish and wildlife populations depend on 2% of the landscape called riparian for all or some smaller part of their life cycle requirements. Beavers enhance that 2%. So if a single beaver pond is good, many improve the situation across the watershed and increase the ability of beaver to persist and also enhance the larger benefit package. Potential for more beavers and their benefits exist in the foothills and in the parkland, which is where I hail from, as well as in the grasslands and the boreal forest. Unfortunately, with all the good potential benefits of beavers out on the land, also comes the potential for the bad of living alongside beavers. These watershed superheroes can still be pesky rodents, North America's largest rodent, as a matter of fact, that have a knack for plugging culverts, for flooding roads, and of course, beavers have a knack for going out there and cutting down trees. They're second to us in the ability to cut down trees. No other animal in North America can cut down a tree of greater than, well, 2-foot diameter, but even larger. We have chainsaws, beavers have their teeth. I think it rubs us a little wrong. They're able to do something we need a machine to do. I've tried chewing my way through it. It works on small branches, but I don't think I'd be felling the type of trees seen in this picture in the bottom left. And our traditional response to this pesky nuisance has been pretty heavy-handed. Guns, traps, dynamite, and backhoes solved our beaver coexistence problems. My dad, who's actually in this presentation, was a Fish and Wildlife officer in Alberta for a brief 36-year stint. And so you can imagine I've heard of and seen my fair share of beavers being lethally managed. Governments actually still actively promote lethal beaver management, so much so that in some counties in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, there continues to be beaver bounties in place to rid us of these menacing creatures. But as you'll recall from earlier, beavers are a rodent that breeds early and yearly and produces several kits being expelled from the colony every single spring. Hardworking parents provide their offspring with the resources and skills to get a good start in life when they leave the complex around 2 years of age. In addition to the parents and the young of the year at the colony still being present, remember those 2-year-old beavers begin dispersing and can travel up to hundreds of kilometers in order to find suitable habitat not already occupied by another beaver territory. And when these dispersing beavers do find a seemingly suitable spot, they often immediately try to set up shop by building dams and trying to secure water depth as well as foraging in the surrounding area for food and building supplies. And what is an unblocked culvert if not a dam 95% of the way built? All they need to do is plug one little hole. And your property full of native or planted trees, if not just a beaver lumber yard. That's an old school joke. Not all of you have been to a beaver lumber yard, but they existed, okay? Problem wildlife behavior ensues, and so you may proceed to propose even more use of guns, traps, dynamite, and or heavy equipment. But that only buys you a bit more time without an active beaver in the area, and with no territoriality established, you actually end up with a beaver turf war next time dispersers arrive. You've created a vacuum. Beavers are effective at filling a vacuum, and nature will seek to fill that vacuum. So are you beginning to bang your head against the wall yet in trying to solve your beaver problem? What we know now is the lethal solution alone doesn't typically solve a problem, and it certainly isn't allowing beavers that can be present to do all of the beneficial things we've already covered. And so what's the alternative? Well, in short, the answer is beaver coexistence. We must coexist, damn it, beavers and us. We need to start seeing beavers as our watershed management partners rather than our enemy when it comes to watershed management and water management and forage management. There are ways to work with beavers rather than constantly fight nature by trying to work against them. They've been here managing riparian areas longer. They'll probably be here long after we're gone, okay? So what we need to look at now is ways to work with beaver rather than constantly fight nature by trying to work against them. And this is what really excited me into this field. My graduate work at the U of S was initiated by the perceived foraging problems of urban beavers in Saskatoon and the recognition by Sherry and others that coexistence there through the use of tree wrapping, also called a non-lethal forage deterrent, could be a technique to retain the benefits of beavers but minimize the effects of their problematic behavior. So we know that beavers play a role in the disturbance regime and the regeneration cycle of forests, but they also happen to occasionally chew down trees that we want to keep in our cities, especially in Saskatoon where they plant memorial trees in memory of people. So it's one thing to lose a person, that's heartbreaking, and another thing to lose the tree you planted to commemorate them because some beaver came in and chewed it down. You can see how that's going to put a damper on coexistence. So the obvious choice in that city was, rather than try to get rid of all the beavers, and that was tried, is to take away the opportunity for beavers to forage down the trees we'd rather they didn't. And so enter wire wrappings in our research, my graduate research, aided by others, some pictured here, showing the most cost-effective beaver deterring and vegetation-friendly solutions. Again, a topic for another presentation we can get into. So my efforts to understand and contribute to beaver coexistence continued when a good friend of mine from university, also an agricultural fieldman for Starland County, had a site her family owned and needed some help with beaver management there. As they're wont to do, the beavers in that creek would invariably wind up flooding over land in their efforts to have too much water rather than too little water. And then the beavers needed to be removed to keep the county road dry and the bridge footings from being eroded. When that removal happened, though, the enhanced wetland and riparian area formed behind the beaver dam in this outflow of the Machichi Reservoir, you can see in the top left there. That outflow would drain, and then much of the wildlife that had been hanging around, muskrats, beavers, more fish, all sorts of wetland birds, frogs and the like, would seem to leave with the water. So Dara set to teaching others that if they wanted the benefits of the wetland, they'd need to coexist with beavers both here and elsewhere in the province. Using WRP funds and initially a partnership with Cows and Fish, Starland County constructed a pond leveler at the site. At first, beavers colonized the site, took advantage of the pond leveler. You can see it pictured there in the top right. But without sufficient woody vegetation to forage and stockpile for winter, the beavers abandoned the site. Efforts were made by Starland County to trap water and reinforce the dam in the way that humans would think to do so. Sandbags mostly, as we can see. Okay, but that too failed. The pond leveler wasn't necessary, wasn't working properly, and the site was again without a wetland or a beaver. In conversations about that site with Dara and with beaver coexistence I'd learned while in graduate school, we realized that I could resolve the issue with first the installation of a beaver dam analog, or a BDA, which is a structure designed to mimic the activity of a real beaver dam and provide some of the same benefits we've talked about. And then we're going to tie that BDA into an improved pond leveler, so that if either the BDA or a returning beaver was too effective in their water storage efforts, we could lower the water levels back down to a manageable depth, meeting that original objective that Starland County had set out with their coexistence project. And so the project, pictured here below in the after, was pulled off with incredible volunteer effort, along with some landowner assistance, and was really quite a success. And it happened just in time for a beaver to return to the site and be the key feature of an interpretive boardwalk. You can see that again in the top left, that has been constructed through that site. So if you're interested in learning more about beaver coexistence, taking a lovely stroll on a beautiful boardwalk to this wonderful memorial gazebo, some hanging lights there that are just unforgettable, a beautiful wetland scene. And you want to learn more about some Starland County ecosystem and riparian habitat and beaver coexistence, I suggest you visit what may be the world's first and only combination BDA and pond leveler, and take a trip out there to the Machichi Reservoir in Starland County. And so I've since gone on with Ubetula to do Ubetula Environmental, of course, the consulting company that we incorporated to complete this work. And so I've gone on with Ubetula to do other coexistence installation elsewhere. Even this past fall, I had my former beaver removing father, pictured here on the right, help me out with the design and installation of this sort of flood prevention structure. He was initially skeptical, but I think he's come around. We can read about that in the chat maybe. We look forward to working in the future with other private landowners, municipalities, developers, and parks on their path towards successful beaver coexistence. And so beaver coexistence done properly is both cost effective and environmentally beneficial work. The materials aren't particularly high tech. As you can see, it's some corrugated pipe and a way to get them there. The process is a little labor intensive, hog panels too. We'll get into the installation more if you're curious. Successful installation does require some experience with construction, destruction of beaver dams mostly, moving awkward loads, and getting creative to solve the little challenges that do come up during an installation. It also requires a healthy amount of not worrying about getting soaked through when beaver canals or ponds turn out far deeper than you initially thought, and then your chest waders for protecting you against. Also, having your physically fit friends join you to help with installations, always a good idea. Thank you, Corey. I appreciate your skills there. Okay. And so for those landowners, land managers, or friends and family of either of the above in this presentation, I do suggest you visit the Mistaki Institute run Beaver Coexistence page at rockies.ca/beavers to learn more about beaver coexistence and landowner resources. In Alberta, beaver dam removal, and this includes properly installed pond levelers that remove some of the water behind the dam, is exempt from Water Act approval. So you could complete these projects with a provincial go-ahead. But the methods to remove the dams do have some rules associated with them. However, and this is a big important point, I'll give you fair warning that since December 2019, we have a new set of rules federally that requires a review of projects near water. Beaver dam removals are a project near water. There's exemptions if you're doing a pure dam removal, but for the installation of a pond leveler, you require a project review. There's pretty significant paperwork involved that's highly technical in nature. So in general, if you aren't already trained as a wetland and riparian areas ecologist, it would probably be best to get one in order to help you complete an initial site visit, properly fill out your submission forms, and then see the project through to completion. And so with that initial site visit as a professional biologist to collect the data, assess the viability of the project, then complete the project review submission to Fisheries and Oceans Canada on your behalf, and finally lead and complete the installation and maintenance, of the flood prevention structures. I can proudly say that Ubetula Environmental can see these beaver coexistence projects through from start to finish. And the good news is you might not have to pay for them all on your own, at least if you're in the Old Man Watershed. So through the Watershed Legacy Program, the Old Man Watershed Council has this program in place and some funding available for these sorts of projects. It's a program where you have to apply by February 28th. So if you're hearing this presentation going, that's just what we need, let's get this paperwork started, or keep it in your mind for next year's application period, which runs from November to February generally. It's a 50% matched funding available. In kind time will count as a matching contribution. So if you're my installation helper, that may count as your matching contribution. Corey doesn't own land with a beaver dam on it, so I don't have to use him. I can't use him if I wanted to. Okay, we might use Michael Durant, who's a landowner in southwestern Alberta and taught me a little about riparian management. Oh, he might even be here. Okay, typical grants under the Watershed Legacy Program range from about $500 up to $10,000, with most being less than $5,000 that are being granted. The average cost of a coexistence install, by the way, is about $2,500 for one solution. That is one block culvert or one ponded system, right? As we add more installations, you're going to buy more materials and invest more time to see the costs rise a little. But still, compared to calling in an ag fieldman, blasting hiring in equipment to clear culverts, all these things. It's extremely cost effective. And Glennis Hood and others did a comparison of cost benefit analysis, and coexistence comes out far ahead of lethal removal and cleanup with heavy machinery. So bear that in mind. The application form to the Watershed Legacy Program is here. Any individual or groups eligible, so long as it's for a boots on the ground stewardship project. These are wading boots on the water in the Riparian area. So we certainly qualify. Beaver coexistence projects planned and installed by UBETULA are applied wetland and riparian area improvements and stewardship projects. So they're certainly a good fit for this Watershed Legacy Program granting fund. For more information, contact Shannon, that's Shannon Frank, at the Old Man Watershed Council, or 403-317-1328 to discuss your beaver coexistence idea. And tell them Kirby sent you, okay? We've talked a little bit about how should be a good fit. Okay, and remember, although the beaver, tireless maintenance worker that they are, won't always see the good you're trying to do for them, they might instead make a counter move to your initial coexistence effort. So with any coexistence installation, plan on maintenance and plan on some adjustments to the plan being made. These two are all part of the process and just another problem to solve without wishfully hoping to try and permanently solve the beaver problem by killing them off for good. You remember there's no such thing, right? At the end of the day, we can live alongside beavers and benefit from all that the original riparian manager, and the best damn one at that, has to offer us. I hope you've been partially inspired to consider how you might contribute to beaver coexistence if you aren't already doing so. And with that, I'll wish you a friendly slap of the tail on the water and signal my exit from this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirby, for that very educational presentation. I don't think I'll ever think of the beavers the same way again. Okay. Although I've always thought they were super cute. So they never bothered me, but
they do have that benefit. They call a baby beaver a mini wood monster, and well, it's floofy parts. And,
there have been a couple questions.
Sure. I have one round of thank yous to make of my own. Okay. I just want to acknowledge the following folks for the use of images and presentation content. Mike to go of Mike's photos and videos of beavers. If you're a beaver fan and you're on Facebook, there's no reason to not follow this guy's page. He's out there taking incredible images and videos. And that was the first and final slides in this presentation. Myrna Pearman, Rob Gardner, Shane Petrie with that excellent cutthroat imagery, the Glenbow Archives for their historical photos, Cows and Fish for the content, and of course, Lauren Fitch and Catherine Hall, two professional biologists in Alberta that I certainly wouldn't be here without. So I appreciate all these folks have done for this presentation and done for me. And I guess with that, I'm now happy to take the questions that are maybe starting to appear in the chat. Betty asked if I could talk a little bit about how beaver population is regulated in a lake environment, thinking about Beauvais Lake in particular near Pincher Creek, 3 kilometers long, 3/4 of a kilometer across. It has several lodges, occasionally see a new one, but the population cannot grow infinitely. Is food availability the limiting factor? So I won't speak on behalf of Alberta Parks and their potential removal of beavers or landowners along that stretch of the park. If humans aren't removing beavers and reducing the population, then yes, food availability would likely be the factor which would regulate beaver populations on Beauvais Lake. I happen to know that system quite well. We take students there for field trips all the time, but prior to that, I'd done a bit of camping in that part of the world. My wife and I took our first camping trip there, as a matter of fact. And so there's on the eastern corner of the lake, quite an intact aspen forest. And that would really sustain a beaver colony for quite a period of time. That's where one of the larger lodges, I think you're talking about are. So in general, about an acre of aspen, so a 64 by 64 meter stand, will sustain a beaver colony, that is the 2 adults, young of the year, and maybe a couple kids for generally about a year, up to 2 years. And so if the beavers can stay in front of the aspen regeneration cycle in a place like Beauvais Lake with quite an abundant aspen resource and not a lot of beavers moving into that system because Beauvais Lake doesn't have a bunch of tributaries, it's nearly into the montane, In fact, half of the park is in the montane. The other is foothill parkland. Anyway, I hid my big natural regions map, but you see, I can't not talk about it, stretch it out and point out where we were. Okay, yes, it would be food more than anything, probably limiting that beaver population in Beauvais Lake. But as I said, there may also be some anthropogenic influence. That is to say, if the beavers plug that road culvert that gets you from near the main, camping area through to the little turnout by the roller coaster trail and that, I suspect you might see those beavers not be present anymore, okay, at least for a while. So again, that may or may not happen. I don't know. If there's a representative from Alberta Parks here that can disclose if there's lethal management to beavers, that would be appreciated. Certainly in other provincial parks, we do lethally manage beavers, okay? Hopefully that answered that. You'll type in the chat further. I understand the benefits beavers bring to flowing water systems. What beneficial things result from beaver in lake environment? So if it's a lake environment with no outlet, then you still see beavers having, and this is sort of what happens on rivers too. If they're not damming, the beaver influence is primarily to the vegetation community and in some small way to sediment transport. So beavers, even in a lake environment, will serve to be a disturbance agent to that vegetation community. So older trees that are mature, some even senescent, past their prime. Again, Beauvais in not a lot of trouble because a windfall will probably knock those down. But in other areas, beavers on those lake ecosystems serve to regenerate the vegetation community by removing those big, overly competitive, mature individuals and giving a younger stand of trees an opportunity to come up and fill its place. And then as we also saw in the work of Glynis Hood and others, beavers, even in lakes, will expand the surface area of the lake by digging those beaver canals and contributing to water storage and also moving sediment around and creating aquatic habitats for different macroinvertebrates and other things that might not thrive in the main body of the lake, but in one of these sort of more sheltered beaver canals that are offering additional habitat there. Hopefully that answers that question as well. So some appreciation, thank you. I appreciate you being here. There's no silly questions, Jordan. As a former student of mine, you should know that. What mechanisms due to beaver dams dominate in reducing nitrogen concentrations in the water? Do you think would be mostly taken out of the water by plant nutrient uptake or through anaerobic conditions, denitrification? If mainly by denitrification, do you know if increased beaver activity in an area correlates to increased greenhouse gas emissions? Oh, this is a real biogeochemical question and a good biogeochemical answer. So yes, you're absolutely on the right track. Much of the denitrification action is occurring. We're going to get a little scientific here, okay? Bacteria that perform denitrification, that is converting, nitrogen into a mineral form again, are doing so generally best under anaerobic conditions. So conditions in the absence of oxygen. And when you take a pond of water and you start piling up sediment behind the beaver dam, you're compressing layers of sediment and you're kind of removing the potential for there to be a lot of oxygen in those benthic conditions. But you're increasing the habitat available for the bacteria that would do the denitrification on the bases of ponds. And so to answer Jordan's question, yes, the pathway of nitrogen removal is largely through the presence of denitrifying bacteria in those substrates. But the other thing is that the sediments themselves bind nitrate and they bind phosphate, and those are trapped and stored in the pond. So rather than free-floating forms of nitrate and phosphate being washed downstream, we see some trapped and stored in the pond as well. That's about as deep as I can go into a biogeochemical explanation and feel like I have my feet under me. So for more on that, there's some excellent work being done in that Devon, England study and in the journal Total Chemistry of the Environment, I believe it's called. There's a really well done phosphorus and nitrogen study in and around beaver dams. And so I'll find that article, Jordan, and I'll send it to you. It's in a literature review I did somewhere, okay? Thank you, Jess. Everett asked, what's the biggest beaver I've ever seen? Well, you remember my second slide, right? Let me scroll all the way back. Again, for the record, never scroll all the way back in a big presentation. Click, 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 click. Let's be patient. We've got nothing but time. Okay, I know. Thank you. Sorry for this rapid transition from slide to slide. This is Everett Hanna's fault. Dr. Everett Hanna, a colleague in the School of Environmental Sciences, had to ask. Okay, well, there's your answer. There's the biggest beaver I've ever seen. Okay, I'm 6'4". Bucky here was just about up to my glasses. That's got to be 6 foot even. That's a large beaver. Now, real life beaver, sorry to dispel and ruin it for the kids in here. That's a person in a costume. Okay, but the biggest real life beaver I've seen was probably an adult female that was gravid, so with kits inside of her, that broke through and was hanging around a residential stormwater pond near Saskatoon. Jess and I had actually visited that system, and I would estimate probably 75, 80 pounds. So quite a really large animal. And so in some places that still have these beaver bounties, they still have beaver contests where trappers harvest the largest animal as if that was some mark of success. And in those contests, they sometimes say 100-pound beaver, this big male was truly the king of the system. Well, in reality, what they obviously caught was a large female full of young. So quite sad. But of course, we do have an overabundance of beavers in some systems, and there is occasionally a need for lethal population removal. But prior to that, what we need is a census to determine what's the carrying capacity of beaver. Do we actually need to remove them from the system, or are we just going to because that's what we've always done? And also in some jurisdictions, is there potential to relocate this beaver elsewhere? In Alberta, we really have very limited ability to do live relocations of beavers. It doesn't exist really on public land, and even on private land, it carries quite a lot of liability, because you may be okay with me moving a beaver onto your place, but your downstream neighbor may not. The beaver leaves your property, goes onto their property, causes some damage. Now, maybe I'm on the hook because I'm the one who put the beaver there. And so you don't find much live relocation. And thus, in an area of overabundance of beaver, we do still see the role for some lethal management. But as I said, it should only be done as a last resort, not a first resort, because hopefully you realize through this presentation all the beneficial things that beavers are doing for us. Okay, is the new permitting from the feds only for fish-bearing streams or all streams? As I understand, these protection guidelines are for protection of fish and fish habitat. Now, fish habitat may be habitat that doesn't have fish yet, but could have fish in the future. So I think you have to be careful. I understand if it's a by no means fish-bearing stream, or it's an anthropogenic stream, so a dug canal, or a stormwater outfall, or a drainage or something like that, then the regulations relating to the program review and approval aren't necessary. Okay, they're not applicable. But you have to be really careful and see, is there a way that this thing could become fish-bearing? Is there connectivity, even connectivity that may be partially degraded now, that may come up again in the future? So it's a good GIS, Geographic Information System exercise, to really see all of the spatial pieces that come together to current or future fish-bearing habitat. And that's where I said it's best to bring a professional on board early, and ideally a professional who's a professional biologist or someone with sort of a very thorough wetland and riparian area working knowledge and fisheries knowledge as well. So what about Montaigne, Betty, in these Beauvais Lake beavers? Is it do they simply go down the outlet stream? Yeah, potentially down the outlet stream, or as I said, they may go overland. But beavers engaged in overland travel near Beauvais Lake face many a danger. There's the private landowners who may not like the idea of a beaver moving through. There's a lot of bears, there's a lot of cougars, there's wolves, there's coyotes, there's all sorts of things that are going to take out a beaver engaged in overland travel. So quite a dangerous passage. That's why I don't think we've seen the spread of a lot of beaver colonies from Beauvais Lake. Although I know not far east of there, a few other sites, and in the Mill Creek, there's some beavers at times. So they're certainly in that area. Okay, question here now from Dave England. I wonder who that guy is. Oh, yeah. So in another presentation, we talk about beaver coexistence and tools and some work we've done. So the question was, is wrapping trees with chicken wire effective? Are there other products you would recommend for wrapping? So wrapping trees with chicken wire, what we call poultry wire. You probably have a picture of this in your mind, and you're right. It's what you think it is. It's about 3 feet tall, these hexagonal weaves, very thin gauge wire, and people wrap that around a tree, sometimes multiple times, and they sort of move up the tree, and it is effective in stopping beaver foraging. But the consequence is that trees continue to grow. That's why we like them. They get bigger all the time. That's how they sequester carbon and everything else. And when they do continue to grow, that chicken wire that was protecting the beaver girdles the tree. It chokes it, right? It cuts through the cambium layer. It breaks up the ability of tree to move water and nutrients from its crown to its trunk to its roots. And eventually the girdling will kill the tree. So you were trying to save the tree with your efforts, and you killed it by loving it too much. So chicken wire, absolutely not an effective means if you want to keep the tree alive. The beavers will quit foraging, but the tree won't live. What we install and what we suggest is a 2 by 2 inch spacing on those wires. So that's a size. You can go 2 by 4 inch, but any bigger than that. And we found beavers can get their teeth in and do damage to the tree, even wire wrapped. You need to anchor this solution in place, so tent pegs or some other anchor. And then it needs to be about a foot taller than the height a beaver can reach. Now, beavers walk up to the tree from the water and they forage, but they also come out in winter when there's snow cover and they walk along the snow and they forage. So you need to think about, does my wire wrapping extend a foot above the height a beaver can get to in any season? Because they don't hibernate. Beavers don't hibernate, right? They can potentially be active all year long, and they won't eat from the food cache. If the weather's warm enough, they can get out and find new things to forage. That food cache is there for an emergency, right? So we recommend a different type of wire, and there's a good video by the City of Calgary Parks showing how to install that product. But if you pick up a roll of this and it weighs, 40 or 50 pounds, and you say, geez, I don't really want to spend a whole day or a couple days installing this stuff, and I haven't done it before, I'm not sure what I'm doing, you betcha Environmental happy to come out and help with the forage protection side of beaver coexistence as well. Okay, many beavers, this is from Everett, many beavers live in systems where dams be damned, like the Old Man River. How does their ecology and behavior change in such settings? Well, I think what Everett's referring to there is what we call non-dammable rivers. So in systems that are too large for a dam to exist, or they experience a flood regime which is incompatible with damming, flashy systems where dams are just blown out. What we see is beavers move away from trying to retain water on those systems, and they just try and find portions of the system that will have abundant flowing water and of a sufficient depth that rather than build a dam and build a lodge in the middle of that beaver pond, the beavers are going to live along a bank. So they'll excavate into the bank, an underwater entrance, just like if it was a freestanding lodge. They'll build a protective covering on that bank lodge, just like if it was, in the center of the pond. But instead of being a 360-degree woody enclosure, half of it is subterranean, sort of built into the bank, and half of it is the woody protection out front with sticks and mud and everything reinforcing it. And beavers are going to, as I said, do that in places with flowing water, with water of a sufficient depth that they can still get out under the ice and go and do their foraging or get at their food cache. And the other thing we find beavers doing in non-dammable systems is they especially go look for places that don't freeze. So below the outlets of dams, or near water treatment plants, or near power generation stations where thermal pollution is a factor, we find concentrations of beaver colonies, because then they don't have to try and swim under or through the ice. They can just live where there is no ice. It's life in a hot tub for Castor canadensis. And then, as I said, depending on the food availability, sometimes we see that the colony density either increase or decrease. Foraging habits will change based on availability as well. There's not a ton of research on urban beavers. In fact, I had one of the joys of being, we have two manuscripts from press right now, both looking at urban beaver ecology, and that will be one of about 6 that maybe exist in the entire literature for North America. So it's a paucity of information on urban beavers and beavers on non-dammable rivers as well. Okay. What all do beavers eat? Well, vegetation primarily. Woody vegetation makes up about 53% of the diet. So willows and poplars and other plants that have evolved along. But we've found beavers that have eaten choke cherry, and they've eaten apple, and they've eaten Russian olive, and they've eaten silverberry, and they've eaten, if you want scientific names, I can throw those in too, if you're unsure. So beavers will eat woody vegetation, but they also forage on a lot of herbaceous vegetation as well. In a recent video, I accidentally said herbivorous vegetation. So let's set the record straight. I know the difference. Okay, it's herbaceous. That's what I wanted to say. So carex, the sedges, they'll eat rushes, bulrushes. They'll eat riparian grasses. They'll eat what's the one I want? Pond lilies. You know, as we've seen in a viral video, they'll even eat cabbage served right to them. Hopefully, you guys have seen, you know, that video going around the internet. So if it's plant and it's edible, chances are a beaver will try eating it. I've seen beavers chewing thorny buffalo berry and other things that I went, there's no way I would put that in my mouth. But if you need to eke out a living and the alternative is you starve to death, I guess anything that is woody and can be eaten is going to get stored. Okay. In areas that beavers have cleared out a stand of beavers, this is the last question I'm going through, by the way. So if you have more, I've got nowhere to be. Feel free to keep asking them in the chat. In areas that beavers have cleared out a stand of trees, from your experience, have you seen this give rise to increased invasive plant species due to the disturbance beavers create? That's a good question, Jordan. Well, I think you have to bear in mind that a stand of native vegetation cleared out in an area where there's no propagules of invasive species is not going to magically get invasive species, right? They're going to get regeneration of native plants. But if you're in an area where native plants are cleared and there is a potential for introduction of invasive species, or like we saw in Saskatoon, Rhamnus cathartica, the European buckthorn, is readily abundant. When you clear out some of those native species, then yes, there is a potential to see a spread of invasive species into that habitat. But what's important there, and I think this is something, who knows, maybe I'll have to spend a PhD on it, is beavers continue to forage from a stand of vegetation, and they don't care necessarily if it's invasive or native. And there's been some efforts to encourage beavers to select for invasive species, limited success, but it's still being done. There's not a lot of research on how beavers are really shifting their forage in the presence of an abundance of invasive species. And so there's a potential, of course, during a reseeding event in an area that beavers have disturbed to have invasives creep in. But if it was an intact, healthy stand and beavers removed some of the vegetation and maybe created some bare ground, chances are you'll still see native species come back. So they're not like a disturbance agents like, say, a clear-cut timber harvest would be, where not only are you disrupting all of the trees, whereas beavers are being rather selective, you're also really doing a lot to disrupt the soil profile as well, because generally when they cut those trees down, they have to use pretty heavy machinery. So there's compaction and there's all sorts of other factors there. So I certainly would say there's potential that beavers could play a role in invasive species propagation, but they would very unlikely be the only factor. Although, you know, that could be a great senior project for someone at Lethbridge College to go in and investigate. I know beaver dams, I know beaver sites minutes away walking, and I'm happy to go down there. So Jess here said, I thought I saw, Jess was featured in this presentation as well, but I don't want to scroll you back through 52 slides to find her. One trip through the whole presentation. Oh, what the heck, because I'd like you to see my website on the last page. Okay, sorry everyone, I wouldn't normally run you through all the slides in the presentation twice, but what the heck, we're friends. Hopefully we're all united as beaver believers now.
We are just special, that's all.
Pardon?
We're just special.
That's right. So I mentioned here, Jess asking a question about some beaver coexistence technique. Here's Jess in the middle there helping me collect some data in Saskatoon during my graduate work. Thanks again for that, Jess. Where people are beginning to paint trees to prevent beavers from chewing them. Of course, can't find the article. That's okay. Is that actually true? Is it effective management? So yes, I mentioned the Mastaki Institute earlier out of Calgary and their rockies.ca/beaver site. They've done a little more sort of applied research in the Fish Creek Provincial Park, and they've done a combination of latex paint with playground sand. I forget the exact mixing ratio. It's quite interesting. They actually match the paint color to the color of the vegetation they're predominantly painting, so that this deterrent is almost camouflage. Well, it is camouflage. You have to go looking for the painted trees. And they've seen, again, some very light data analysis and a fairly less than robust experimental design, but they saw in some cases up to 75% reduction in foraging activity in comparable sites painted to non-painted. So in that sort of initial trial, yes, they're seeing some success. Now, what we've learned is this isn't a new technology. The Martinez Beaver Group and others have done painting where they are, and they've found painting is sort of like girdling. It's effective until the tree grows. And at which point the paint cracks and there's fissures that develop in the paint, and then the beavers go, oh, never mind, I could forage there. And they get a chew started, and they might eventually, hit some painted part and go, oh, this is gross, but I've come this far. What's a little bit of sand in my teeth? So something to bear in mind. Painting can be effective, but it has a role to play, and I don't think it's quite so robust as a solution as wire wrapping. So Judy here, as we're developing a beaver management plan, this is in Port Moody, BC, we found the term carrying capacity become a red herring for a city manager who did not want the beavers around. There seems to be a lot of variables for the term that the manager wanted nailed down in order to determine how many beavers could live in the watershed. I wonder if the term colony density would be a better way to describe a capacity. That's a great question, Judy. Thank you for your coexistence work in Port Moody and elsewhere. Carrying capacity has an ecological definition, and it's, of course, Everett can correct me on this if I'm wrong. He's heard my ecology lectures many times because I lecture down the hall from his office. So there's the ecological carrying capacity, which is the ability of a habitat to sustain a population of animals. If they overshoot it, factors come into play where they decrease under the carrying capacity. And so there's a carrying capacity that's the ability of this environment to provide the necessities of life to some population of animals. Ecological carrying capacity. Now, what your city manager in Port Moody may be dealing with is what we call the societal carrying capacity. And that's a really important point. So although you may demonstrate through sound science and data collection that we have this depth of water and we have this density of vegetation, which beavers will forage, and, by these experiments, we can do sort of and there's models to find the carrying capacity of streams for beaver dams and beavers in the system. The BRAT model, Beaver Restoration and Analysis Tool by Joe Wheaton and others is one. And there's older, more sort of simple logarithmic models to use as well. You can start to get a number. Sorry, read a pun in the chat. You can start to get a number of how many beavers that habitat could sustain ecologically, but that's not the societal carrying capacity. And if that land manager says, I don't want any trees chewed down by beavers, and I will not tolerate flooding, and my landowners who own property adjacent to the systems have said the same, you might have an ecological carrying capacity of 1 beaver colony per 3 kilometers of stream length, but your societal carrying capacity is 0. And so you're not going to make any headway saying we can support more beavers here if the society has no willingness to support the beavers. And so it's really important when I use carrying capacity, I separate ecological or biological carrying capacity from the societal carrying capacity. And those numbers sometimes are the same thing. In a group of beaver believers, let's hope they're the same thing. In fact, we're at risk of overshooting ecological carrying capacity because if one beaver is good, more or better. And then if they do go past K, the carrying capacity, we'll just let the forces of population regulation run their course. Beavers will reduce below carrying capacity again. But that's not the societal carrying capacity. So I like your point that you could use colony density as a benchmark to describe an ecological carrying capacity. But I think in that plan, you should be very explicit about addressing the societal carrying capacity and the framework you could put in place to overcome the barriers to a greater societal carrying capacity. And that's where having, of course, a beaver coexistence consultant such as myself, or in BC, Adrian Nelson of Humane Solutions, he would be another really good resource to bring on board for a project like that. It doesn't have as much of the science background, but certainly the technical installation of these sorts of projects and some of the considerations in working with municipalities and others. Okay, last question. Are beavers good broadcasters? There's a pun. Everett and I have long pun chains back and forth of any particular seeds. Well, I think there's potential that we talked about beaver forage being a lot of woody vegetation. So when they take the woody vegetation, what they're really looking for is the cambium layer, that growing layer of tissue. That's the high in nutrients. They're not really foraging seeds of woody plants. It's not impossible, you know. So then the question is, the beaver gets ambitious in his snacking. He ingests a samara, the winged fruit of a maple. Everett's from out east, so we want to talk about maples, so get him excited, okay? They ingest the samara, they pass through the digestive tract of the beaver, and maybe they survive. And in that example, you know, then maybe that seed floats downstream or into a pond it wouldn't have otherwise made its way to. And in this hypothetical, the great Canadian icon that is the beaver just reseeded another great Canadian icon, the sugar maple. Is it possible? I don't know. Great research to maybe do by someone. When they ingest carex, certainly then we know carex seeds thrive scarification in the organs of animals. In fact, they sort of require it before they'll grow. That's why a carex can go through a duct and come out a ready to plant seed. And so then, yeah, maybe beavers in that example would be a good broad castor of a seed. I'll leave it to you to research other examples of where beavers may broadcast seeds. That hasn't come up in my own experience, but certainly something I'll be on the lookout in the literature for now. Okay, Mike has a raised hand. Mike, I don't know how to deal with your raised hand because I don't know if there's a way we can invite you into the presentation to speak. So feel free to interrupt me by typing into the chat or however you can question.
I'd just like to know how you calculate the transit time of water through the dam.
So again, that's not research I'm doing, but what they're doing is they're a couple things. One, you can use isotope markers. So just like you calculate water transit time through soil or anything else, you can use deuterium and other isotope markers. What is the one? My office mate, who's not here, is named Josh Bishop. He's a hydrogeologist. Josh, I wish you were here to talk about this. But isotope markers is one way that they can then, you know, sample water above stream and downstream that bears this isotope marker. And then you can see the residence time in ponds or the residence time in a stream or the residence time in groundwater before that water's transferred back downstream. And then for stage, that is the height at which water flows through and the timing of that, they're basically putting in water loggers above stream and downstream and then monitoring, you know, here's when we saw the flows and then they dissipated and then we saw an increased flow at this point in time, but no greater contribution from the headwaters. While that solved for where'd the water come from, it came from residents in the beaver pond. And so then they can track that lag. Does that explanation make sense?
Yes, I understand about isotopes. Thank you.
Okay.
Good. Yeah, and to the best of my understanding, that's how that work is being performed. And as I said, I heard Joe talking, Dr. Weed talking about that research. I'm not sure if it's published yet. But that's something that maybe we can include in the notes of this presentation if that is something we find and you're interested. Or you can, at the bottom of this slide I have up still for more information about professional beaver coexistence installations in Alberta or links to scientific articles I've referenced but don't have handy. Feel free, visit youbetula.com. There's a contact us button right near the top of the page and I'm happy to get in touch with you that way, Mike. Thanks for your question. So Betty had another one. How long do beavers live? Well, right up until something kills them. If they were to die of old age, it would maybe in a natural system, often around 10 years, some as long-lived as 20 years. Certainly the ones that are living in zoos or private sanctuaries, those sometimes go 20 years, even 20 years plus. In a natural system, remember that every spring, 2-year-old beavers are dispersing across the landscape, and that is a dangerous travel. So a lot of beavers don't live past 2.5 because they just, as they're dispersing, that's when they fall victim to any number of depredation events. But again, the average age, let's say, well, maybe 5, you know, and I talked earlier about, we know beavers, as they get older, especially beaver females, have less and less offspring. And so one of the benefits of retaining a beaver family at your site is that, yes, right now, if they're young, they're maybe being highly reproductive and they're chewing down maybe a little bit more of the vegetation than you would like. And of course, you can protect some, but leave some. But the good news is if you maintain that colony, at a certain point, they'll have all the dams built that they really need. So there's less foraging for building material. And then the adult pair will also become less reproductive in their output. And so you're seeing less new individuals being born into that system every year. And so the overall impact of that beaver colony is reduced over time. Versus you take one family, you remove it, now you've got 2 new families come in, or establishing beavers competing for that territory, both early in their lives having lots of offspring. And what you see is that the net number of beaver following a removal might actually be greater than if you had left a colony intact to get old in place, if that makes sense. Okay, well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to take some of your time and talk about my friend and colleague in riparian management, the beaver. And if more questions do come up, by all means, reach out to me at youbetula.com. If there's someone you think, and maybe you're that person, has some beaver coexistence challenges you'd like some help in addressing, please reach out to me. And I'm looking forward to working together or just sharing this information with others. Thanks, everyone.